Sometimes I talk about this as like riding the Eurostar. Like a lecture is a really pleasant train ride, and I'm just staring at the beautiful vista. And then active learning is much more of a road trip where like we keep switching the driver and we're not sure where we're going. And maybe we get into a couple of accidents. But that can be so much more valuable for us as an experience than sitting by passively. I think we're starting to see people adding more friction to the experiences with ChatGPT, which will make them more valuable learning experiences. Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, a high-quality journal, like surprising findings, is that students thought they learned less. They went through the lecture and they conflated the ease of kind of sitting back and getting told stuff with that felt good, so I feel like I learned, even though they did less well on an objective exam. And they conflated that back and forth of, hey, I felt like I wasn't really sure what I was doing and I had to try hard and I had to struggle with the answers and I don't think I got anywhere, with not learning, when in fact they were able to perform on tests much better. I'm here because I'm an expert, and you are, but your job is to not show your expertise. Your job is to help students acquire their own. So anything you can do in service of getting out of the way of the learning process is really important.
Today, I am welcoming Dr. Christine Lusser. Dr. Lusser, please tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Thanks, Ryan. I am a cognitive neuroscientist by training. I got my PhD, feels like 100 years ago, and I studied face perception. But what I was most excited about is how you take insights from behavioral science and neuroscience. How can we change the world to make people better learners, better humans, better contributors to society? And I thought I was going to be a very traditional research-based academic. I spent 3 years at Harvard Business School. I taught in the Harvard Psych Department for a year. And then I met a bunch of crazy people who are going to build a university from scratch. And I said, that sounds really fun. And it's been a lot of work, but it has been really lovely. So I helped build a business college at Minerva University. And when that got its own accreditation in 2021, it spun out. And we took what we had learned there about building really cohesive, effective learning experiences. And now a group of us partner with universities all over the world to help them rethink their student experience so that it is more relevant to the 21st century, more effective because it uses the science of learning, and more experiential because we try to get people to see the connections inside and outside of the classroom.
I am super excited by everything you just said, especially since I studied instructional communication. So learning how to teach is something I've been obsessed with since like 2004. I've spent, over 10,000 hours, contact hours, learning how to teach better in higher education. And this is a space you're deeply familiar with. And one thing that I know that people struggle with is feedback. Can you tell us how feedback should look?
Needs to very clearly achieve your goals. And if your goals are to actually help people see where their strengths are and their weaknesses are, you want to separate those piles pretty intentionally. But one of the funniest things that seems to happen in the feedback space that we've kind of naturally fallen into doing as humans is something called a compliment sandwich. And so I might say, hey, Ryan, you have such a great radio voice and I love everything that you talk about. But then you did this introduction, it was a little awkward and I wasn't sure where I was going to take it. And so maybe we could work on this. But by the way you made that jump to the transition where we talked about blah, blah, blah. So what I feel like I did was very clearly tell you what was good and what was bad. And I'm really mostly focused on clearly communicating the bad thing. And what you feel like you heard was things are great. So when we bury that feedback inside, and I don't know any research on doing the opposite. If I start off with bad and I go to good and then I go to bad again, doesn't seem like a great thing to do either. But really clearly separating those things out is where you get the clearest sense for yourself that you've communicated well, and the clearest sense for, we'll call them the learner, that they understand what the two different buckets look like.
I was in a debate with a colleague recently about this compliment sandwich idea. And she was arguing that this is not direct communication and it's actually hurting people. So would you agree with that? That it's not as direct as it should be and it's actually hurting people? Because it sounds like this kind of feedback would be more useful because it would help them be more receptive to the thing they need to work on. But in actuality, that's not true?
I think the trick is starting off with strengths can be very helpful. And it can help people be more receptive to where they have to grow. The trick is when you add more positive feedback on the end, it kind of muddies the waters. So the best practices that I've heard about giving feedback are really focused on saying like, hey, here are the strengths, here are the weaknesses, and then sort of leaving it there. You can have a discussion about how that lands for people. You can have a discussion about the next project that's coming up and how they're going to leverage it. But you don't want to weave back and forth between negative and positive because A, it's confusing for the listener, but B, it gives us this sort of fake sugar candy that it went really well from our perspective as a communicator. And they have the sense that it went well. But the thing I think you heard was where to improve. And the thing you think you heard was mostly the positive stuff because I've smushed the other things in between.
Makes sense. I'm thinking about like written feedback because I teach mainly online asynchronous courses. And in written feedback, I always pop out the things to work on. So I'll have like, okay, here's some good things, but the things to work on are popped out. Do you think that that helps? Because technically it is weaving and it's doing the wrong thing. And my argument with my colleague was, well, no, you want them to be receptive and you want to to build and help the relationship move forward from teacher to learner, student to professor. So having that actual positive stuff at the end seemed like an important relational context touch point.
It doesn't really matter what it feels like. So when I was envisioning it as a PDF, one of the things that I used to do a lot of was tag as I go, because that's how I'm experiencing it when I'm evaluating work. So I'll be like, this is a great thesis statement. This evidence doesn't support, blah, blah, blah. And so I almost have like my running monologue of the things as I'm reacting to them. And I think you can put yourself in the other shoes, which sometimes faculty don't do very well, and say, actually, how does it feel to go all over the map for this thing? And so our job as instructors might be to do that as part of our own work process, but then saying like, here's the synthesis of what I want you to focus on. And here is the synthesis of things you did really well. As long as those are clearly called out for students, I think that's where we see them clearly getting the feedback as opposed to what the compliment sandwich is if it was like a club sandwich. And that's what I think my comments used to feel like is whiplash going back and forth. And I always wanted to run this experiment. So you can imagine giving comments as people go through. And you can also imagine Minerva's trying to do really evidence-based stuff. So those comments often have a rubric score attached to them about a set of durable, transferable skills that are the learning outcomes. And so I, as a student, I open that. I've got like a 2, and then I've got a 4, and then I've got a 3, and then I've got another 2. And they're all on different learning outcomes. And early on, I would leave a lot of feedback, and I still do. But students were like, I don't know how I did. Like, can't you just give me a grade? And I was like, no, that's not the point.
Yeah.
But I want to, like, am I an 80? Am I a 90? Is it a B? Is it a D? No, you're getting specific granular feedback on skills. This is good practice. But that synthesis and helping them see what it all means and kind of comes together as, I found that if I just left a comment at the top, and I will be very honest that sometimes they were deeply generic, like, Ryan, this is a great essay, although I think you could have put more time into it. I can say that to everyone. People were like, thanks for the really great feedback. I always wanted to run the experiment where I left in the synthesis comment and took it out. And I think it's because our brains really want that cognitive closure of feeling like they saw the big picture. And that's why having the list of things to improve and things to really keep strengthening separately can be helpful.
Has AI made an impact on feedback? And if so, what does that look like?
I think that we are just going to be so flabbergasted by the ability to give feedback with AI that it's very hard to predict where it will go. I worry that we'll start to use it for teaching and learning in really strange ways that don't actually support what we think it's doing. And so, from my perspective, if you think about a learner who's using AI, and you can do this experiment, you can ask people really naturally, like, okay, Ryan, what are you going to do if I want you to go to ChatGPT to learn this thing you care about? So what would you do? What do you care about first? Let's pretend.
Well, public relations is one of the things.
Okay. How are you going to ask ChatGPT to help you learn this? What are you going to type? Just like come up with a prompt really fast.
Do all the best practices like offering to make sure that I assign it a role, I assign it context, I assign it a task, and all those good things. And specifically, I would ask it to elaborate on the top 5 PR models.
So this is a really natural thing to do. And this is how I interacted with it in the past. What you get when you talk to GPT like that is a lecture. You get a whole bunch of notes and you can say, hey, teach me about this. And it will just tell you stuff. And so even if you have given it a great prompt that you're an expert, you know everything about this field, even if you say you're an active learning expert, it still is this ask to be very unidirectional. It is there to tell you information instead of there to help you retain, synthesize, and analyze. So I think students broadly, whether you're in a class or whether you're just a human trying to learn things, don't know how to ask people to guide them through a learning experience because it's not where we gravitate. We think we want knowledge and we say things like, tell me about the top 5 models, and they just tell you. I'm like, okay, that's really helpful. But you can say, I want you to be active learning, and it can kind of break it down for you. But if you're very intentional about the way that you ask, you say, I want you to ask me questions about it and refine my understanding over time. Then you get an experience that feels more frictiony and hard, but is actually going to result in better outcomes in terms of you understanding it and in terms of you retaining it. So that's one side for all of this with the learning. Does that make sense in terms of what our default side is versus how we should be using it?
Yeah, and I've heard Conmigo does something similar where it's asking learners to ask questions so that it can not give them the answer, but give them hints and say, that's close, but here's something else to think about.
I think this is going to require designers who aren't just saying like, hey, I can know all the information in the world and I can give it to students. You need people who understand active learning to almost introduce more friction than anybody wants into the process. And what's really neat about that is we'll capture what we know about active learning classrooms, which is that students think they learn less when they actually learn more. And so there's this great study out of Harvard. I think it was a physics class published in 2016. Imagine we're in this class together. And for the first half, you're in the group that's listening to a lecture. And then you have to take some sort of exam to test your understanding. And then the second half, you're in an active learning classroom and you take something that tests your understanding. And then I'm in the opposite group just so we counterbalance for time. So I start with the active learning and then I take my test and then I do lectures and then I take my test. The thing that is not surprising at all is no matter when it happens, we both learn more in the active learning condition because we're sort of struggling through it. And that's how it's getting inside of our heads. What was surprising and why this was published in a journal like Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, a high quality journal, like surprising findings, is that students thought they learned less. They went through the lecture and they conflated the ease of kind of sitting back and getting told stuff with that felt good, so I feel like I learned, even though they did less well on an objective exam. And they conflated that back and forth of, hey, I felt like I wasn't really sure what I was doing and I had to try hard and I had to struggle with the answers and I don't think I got anywhere with not learning when in fact they were able to perform on tests much better. So I think we have these things in our head that make us want to feel like we're on, sometimes I talk about this as like riding the Eurostar. Like a lecture is a really pleasant train ride and I'm just staring at the beautiful vista. And then active learning is much more of a road trip where like we keep switching the driver and we're not sure where we're going and maybe we get into a couple of accidents, but that can be so much more valuable for us as an experience than sitting by passively. I think we're starting to see people adding more friction to the experiences with ChatGPT, which will make them more valuable learning experiences.
That insight is incredibly helpful for people who are engaging with these new technologies. I'm thinking about my first experience as a TA. I was the lab instructor for a communication lab, and that's all we did is we got to practice and engage. And people have the expectation, and we had both lecture and lab at the time, but people have the expectation that, oh, I'm going to have a lecture and that's how I'll learn the best. I'm a lecture learner. And it's the exact opposite. They often will learn far more with that struggle. So it resonates nicely with my personal experiences, especially early on when you're asking students to struggle and that impacts their learning experience because struggle is uncomfortable and that discomfort might impact things like teaching evaluations. Tell me about that relationship because that's a different kind of feedback too. So if I ask my students to struggle more, will that impact my ability to earn a living?
Yes. And one of the things that I think is almost malpractice is we don't contextualize why we're doing the best practices that we're doing. So a lecture is malpractice. We know that students don't learn from them. But it's also not great for students to be thrust into an active learning environment without the proper framing for like why we're doing this thing that is difficult. And so I'm sure even way back when you were TAing this class, you're like, you're doing this because you don't learn to communicate by listening to somebody. You learn to communicate by literally communicating. So I think we don't do enough to bring our students on that journey with us about why we're setting up good learning experiences the way that we're doing it. But to your point about whether or not it's going to hurt your teaching evaluations and whether or not that's something that's going to impact your living, I think framing can only go so far. If students have infinite choice about the classes that they can take, There will be some percentage, I hope it's a high one, who see high value learning experiences are like, I want those and I'm going to learn stuff and I'm going to be engaged and this class is going to be fun, even though it's uncomfortable. But there's also some students who will just be like, well, I could sit in that lecture over there. And so one of the things when we work with universities and when we built Minerva University from the ground up that was so important was thinking about how the different components work together. And what we found was there were a lot of faculty who came to Minerva early on who had tried these active learning exercises in other classrooms at other institutions. And there's a portion of students who are just like, well, that class is more work than this one. And I'm kind of here to learn stuff, but mostly get my sheet of paper. And then they just like drop your class because it seems like it's going to be a lot of work. So if you can create the framing and the expectation and the student experience where they can't opt out, there isn't an easier, more passive option. That's where I think you see really transformative effects at an institutional level because students understand that this is not something that this weirdo over here is asking me to do that like this very traditional teacher won't. It's just what is in the institution's DNA. And we're all going to work together in an active learning environment to make sure that students have a cohesive experience where it's not dependent on who you randomly got as your professor.
And I find we use a lot of project-based learning, right? So we're having them develop an integrated marketing communication plan. We're having them develop in my AI and personal branding course. They're trying to develop a portfolio to target either clients or employers. We have them develop a whole podcast in my podcasting class. So there's a whole bunch of kinds of projects that I would call active learning because they're having to something. And I wonder in your research in project-based learning like these kinds of things, are there do's and don'ts that faculty and students should be aware of?
Yes, but I will take a step back to answer it kind of more broadly and then get into specifics. So, one of the things that's really beautiful about project based learning is I'm getting hands on application. I am going in and I am saying, hey, I'm going to get my hands dirty building this thing. It's going to be a podcast, it's going to be my portfolio. You learn so much doing that. But one thing I see people struggle with is then transferring what they learned through that project to other contexts and even other projects. And I think as instructors, sometimes we're not as intentional as we could be about the core learning outcomes that are inherent in the project. And so if you are making a podcast, you are doing these durable, transferable skills like I have to take my audience's perspective. I have to project plan really well. I need to create a marketing campaign, which means that there's some aspect of visual design. I probably want to make sure there's a narrative structure to it. So there's a storytelling learning outcome. And one of the challenges when we throw people into projects is if we haven't given them what underlying skills there are, and this goes back to our point about feedback, they'll figure it out and they might even do a very good job with it, but they're not going to pick that up and see why it's relevant for when then they go and they show up and do their branding portfolio. So I think to tie it back to your question about do's and don'ts, when we're thinking about designing a project, it's not just about what the outcome is, it's about the process I expect students to go through when they're doing that and making sure that they see why the skills that they're learning here are useful in other contexts. And I think project-based learning on its own is so much better than just passive learning, but it can be even more powerful if you take the time to let students know what the different components of the project are. Or even in a cool way, you could have them identify those for themselves as a checklist in advance of running through the project.
I love that. I know the rationale section might be skipped. They're like, just tell me what to do. I don't need to read this rationale section. I know that sometimes the course level objectives or the module level objectives might also be skipped because I don't need to know that. I just need to know what I need to do to turn in my grade, right? So what we do have is we have a reflective learning after with specific questions. But I like your idea of asking them to identify the skills that they just practiced more definitively, more concretely, because I can imagine that being something that would give them confidence as they go on to work with clients or employers.
So I can get really nerdy and into the weeds for a second, which is the work that we do when we do design consulting with universities is really about having a coherent institutional approach to what those learning outcomes are. I suspect your school has a mission statement where it talks about teaching people to be critical thinkers or creative thinkers. And then you can ask somebody, you're like, where do you do that? Like, what does that mean? Because critical thinking isn't one thing. Creative thinking isn't one thing. Problem solving isn't one thing. And so we help leadership at institutions say, like, this is our language of skills. And it can't be at the level of like skills taxonomy with 32,000 things in it. But it also can't just be like critical thinking, creative thinking, effective communication, and effective interaction. Like, that's not useful either. So when you right size those learning outcomes, what you can do is then share them across courses. Because if you've identified durable, transferable skills that are going to help students do stuff out in the real world, they should also help you for your disciplinary stuff. And I think I can do this without dumping the coffee in my lap. But the first time I show somebody a skill, it might look like this. And then if I show it to them in a different context and apply it to a different kind of project, it can still be that same core skill, but now it looks like this. And then you put it down for a while and you're like, actually, it looks like this. And so you can create a curriculum where in your podcasting class, you've tagged some skills. Students have been explicitly asked to explain how they used it to accomplish the goal. And then they show up in a neuroscience class with me. I'm like, okay, write a grant proposal. You are still using audience awareness. You're still using break down the problem. You're still using narrative structure. So one of the things that I think is super powerful is when universities stop acting like gig economies where we're all allowed to do whatever we want and start helping faculty row in the same direction around these core skills that are not just buried in accreditation documents, but are really foregrounded for students.
The first thing that came to mind was the resistance I experienced when we're working with faculty, or the words academic freedom. And that whole idea, right? I'm sure you hear that all the time. I'm sure you hear that kind of resistance all the time because as in part of my role, I serve as a faculty champion. And one of those sorts of things that I do in that role is to help consult with faculty to build better courses, specifically on online asynchronous courses, because that's where I'm at. I wonder what kind of pushback you have.
The idea of academic freedom, I think it is very important. I think that does not mean that you cannot have constraints on what and how you teach. Not in terms of you're not allowed to talk about this idea, but you can tell students about ideas in any way you want, but you should highlight these core set of skills because we're all here to work towards that. I think we rely on academic freedom, we as faculty, kind of a white flag. We're like, we're waving the academic freedom flag. You can't tell us to do anything. Yes, and. So for me, I think it goes back to understanding why an institution exists. And it really should be to serve students. And students are at the center of every university's mission, but not always at the center of their actions. And so working with faculty is difficult to do if they don't see how they're contributing to that broader vision, mission, and purpose of the institution. So for me, this is usually a leadership transformation. Like, how do we effectively articulate and then communicate to faculty what our group goals are and then help them see their role in it? And what you find is that if you give people the training and the tools to make active learning feel more safe and comfortable, people actually love it. My favorite example of this is when I first got hired at Minerva, we had a guy who was a consultant who then they tricked into being a full-time faculty member and then tricked into being the dean of business school. But he had taught finance at Wharton for 40 years. And I was this neuroscientist. He was this finance guy. We're 50 years apart. No idea how to interact with each other. But we became such this little odd couple where we would take business concepts and bring them to life in this active way. And he was very much one of those people who would edutain. He'd get up on stage. He'd tell funny jokes. He was a good teacher, but it was very passive. And maybe 3 weeks in, he looks at me and goes, I've been teaching wrong my entire career. This is so much better. I think students are learning. And getting people to see the possibility of that, I think, is how you overcome resistance. You need those proof points for people. You can't just force them.
How can students take charge of their learning? Like, what are the things that students should be doing in my class? Like, I know I need to create a welcoming environment. I need to help encourage a sense of belonging. I need to do all of these things in addition to teaching my learning objectives and making sure I'm meeting these other needs.
I have a very nerdy answer that goes back to something called self-determination theory. And there's this research on what helps people thrive. And so 3 fundamental needs that researchers have suggested people need to have met before they can actually engage in real action, where they feel like they're positive and contributing. They're in the workforce, and I apply it to classrooms as well, are the need to feel competent, the need to feel autonomous, and the need to feel belongingness. And so you setting the stage for those needs is really important. And I think if I knew that stuff as a student, I would start to have higher expectations of my faculty members because I would look for places where I felt like I was gaining skills, which we way over index on the competency part, but also places where I'm getting choice in the projects that I work on and places where I'm being asked to create a learning community or do group projects really effectively. So understanding how you learn can make you a more discerning, for lack of a better word, customer and a much better student. And I think it's really about setting yourself up to find the things that are interesting to you so that you can seek out the learning environments that help you achieve those goals. So I always want students like have a plan for why they're taking a course and what they're going to do with it, as well as almost like a personal learning management system to keep track of things. If an institution isn't telling you about the skills, like where's the journal where you're saying, oh, what I really learned here was this? And then ask yourself or ask ChatGPT, like, how can I apply this in other contexts? So I think that there's stand-ins that we can create for ourselves as learners that really are grounded in identifying the things we want to learn, identifying the things we want to apply those learnings to so we can actually get stuff done, and taking the space to reflect so that I can understand if I've actually achieved those goals.
I love that because as faculty, we can take that exact same template and apply it. You mentioned specifically this idea of competency, autonomy, and belonging. And I know that I have struggled based on my experience with the National Student Experience Project and ACUE and Quality Matters and all these kinds of courses that we have from our wonderful academic innovation departments and teaching and learning departments at our universities. They give us ways to help those things, but I want to hear your perspective on improving those three dimensions as faculty. And so that our students can look for opportunities like you just mentioned. How can faculty create those opportunities for students to look for? Because I know I have struggled in the past with providing especially belonging and especially self-efficacy and competence. With autonomy, I'm like, if you have an alternative assignment, I would love to hear it. Let's work together. People rarely take me up on it, but I'm pretty good on autonomy. But those two specifically, belonging and this idea of self-efficacy and competency, which increases throughout the semester, but I always start low. I want to start higher. What can I do?
When you say you start low, what do you mean?
Like the pre and post, like at the very beginning survey, my scores for belonging are lower than I would like, and my scores for self-efficacy are lower than I would like. And they rise throughout the semester as they interact more and we do more stuff. But I want to start higher. What can I do to start
I
higher?
want to give you a little grace. They are
Yeah.
supposed to start low. You're taking a bunch of students out of nowhere and throwing them in this environment together. You can do things to increase belongingness, but it also takes time. Like there is not a magic pill for all of these, which is why there's not a magic pill for learning. One of the things that could bump it up early on is being really explicit about how we're building a learning community, being really explicit about how you're all coming from different backgrounds, but we're going to practice skills with each other so that we're feeling like we're becoming more capable over time together. And so I suspect that they start off pretty high and then they go up. And if you want to bump them, I have a hypothesis that just telling people they exist will bring them up at the beginning. And that goes back to that point we were making before about really including students in the instructional design and the learning journey that you've crafted for them. So it's not hidden. I think we often want to be like the script writer so you can watch a movie and then it feels really lovely and I've unfolded and there are surprise moments. But to get to a script, we've not lived in our own heads. We've really worked with a writing team and we've talked to people about the kinds of narrative structures that work. We've done a lot of research. And I just think we have to involve students more in the learning process.
And the specific kinds of messages early on, like for example, we introduce ourselves. And in asynchronous online learning, there are challenges there to creating these kinds of
Make a video.
communities. What's that?
Do you make a video?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I've got to. Sorry, let me see. Of course, of course, I make a video.
No,
But,
it
but
is
yeah,
not, of course, it is
yeah,
not a given. If I had to introduce myself to asynchronous students, I would just send them like my bio. It'd be really boring, but I'm inspired by how I see you teaching. So I figured you did.
sure. So I have a Adobe Express page with my introduction video, my professional background, and some personal self disclosures to help move the relationship forward because it's a communication class, and relationships are at the center of everything we do. But the specific messages that would increase belonging, for example, saying, hey, this is a learning community where we expect interactions of this quality and we expect respect of this quality. We have these community guidelines that people can read, but it's real hard to get that started. In some courses, it's better than others. In some courses, you have people interacting and asking questions early on, and they're involved in the chat and they're all about it. And in other courses, it's pretty quiet in there. And you're like, I want to play. Come out and play, please.
You're trying to kickstart a feedback loop. You have one person who's really early adopter, very gung ho. It lets other people see that that is a thing that is not just okay, but also kind of fun and acceptable and will improve the experience. So you could just hire a fake student every year and be like, I'm going to give you 10 extra points to be the cheerleader for this entire section. That would be a fun potentially not ethical way to see if that works.
I like that idea. And we know that planning Confederates works in persuasion research, so why wouldn't it in
You just need
education?
you need your course influencer.
Exactly. In the student experience project, we just last semester started working with student experience partners
Oh,
that
tell me more about that.
they're not TAs, they're undergraduates who are not in our discipline from another discipline, who are able to serve as kind of like an ombudsman for the students. And let's say you're intimidated by talking to the professor, or for whatever reason, maybe you don't click with them. You can go talk to this other person who is also a student who can be a voice for students as well. So far, so good. She's given me some wonderful feedback on how to improve my courses even before they began. To say,
It's
oh,
really nice.
be sure to do this, be sure to do that. It was wonderful. Yeah. I'm looking forward to working with her again this semester.
There's two things that highlights, and it really isn't a function of how approachable we are as instructors. It's just that there's an inherent power dynamic. And so people are not as comfortable giving feedback to people in positions of power, full stop. And there are ways that we can make it feel safe to do that, but it's a hurdle that we will probably never completely get rid of. And then the other thing that's really wonderful about having that person be a student is it reminds me of some of the research my friend has done on who we ask for advice. And we think that we want to ask somebody who knows all of the things. Like, do you want to learn cello from somebody who's like a year ahead of you or from yo-yo ma? It's like, I want the expert. And what's really much better is finding somebody who knows where you are and is just a little bit further along. So this person who's serving as the say that word one more time. I know what it is.
Ombudsman, like the voice of the people, right?
Is close enough to the student experience that they're getting better disclosure, but they're also able to contextualize it in a way that we, as being further away, probably can't. So that's such a beautiful structure to have in place. Was that you or was that the institution?
Well, that's the institution. Yeah, we have an amazing academic innovation teaching and learning folks who they don't only give us opportunities for ACUE or Quality Matters instruction to take these courses to become better instructors, but they have other programs like that. We also have an emerging technology partners program. And last summer, we were working on with students to create guidelines for AI usage, for example. And I worked with students to create like an AI cookbook so that students who were intimidated by using AI, which there are quite a few, who don't want to mess with it because that's academic plagiarism and 100 other reasons why you might not want to touch AI when you're a student. We're trying to get them more comfortable with it. So programs like that are just really fun to work with. There are certain things that you've seen in your work and faculty have struggled with that I'm sure our students could benefit from tips and tricks based on your neuroscientist background.
Yeah, I mean, brains just learn. That's what they're supposed to do. You're taking in information all the time. It's really impossible for brains not to learn. They don't always learn what instructors want them to learn. So I could be in a big lecture class and I could learn the right way to do this is to show up, be on ESPN.com all class, and then cram for the exam. Like that is a learning. And it's not what the person standing at the front of the room wanted me to learn. So I think when we go back to design principles and say, how do we think about our goals for students and really design the experience around that, you can come up with creative ideas that pull students into that process much more intentionally.
And in your consultation work, have you seen some common problems? I'm sure you have.
There's a responsibility along with the freedom. I think that is part of it. But this goes to the question of what is an institution for? Have we taken an R1 model where research is very important and also given them the responsibilities to educate a bunch of undergraduates? And should those go together? So a lot of the common problems, I think, stem from not having a clear vision and a clear identity of what the university wants to be and what they want to accomplish. And I think this is sort of a watershed moment for higher ed where faith is tanking. Students are coming out not as well as they would have done if they had not gone at all because of the intense time and costs associated with it. But innovation happens on the edge of chaos. And so I think schools are starting to realize that they can't be everything to everyone. They don't just want to be a copy. They want to figure out what the right school is. And I think students are also coming to that moment. Instead of going to the best school, they're looking for the best school for them. And I'm excited about having the industry mixed up in that way just to see what happens. And I think that it will be fascinating no matter what, but I'm hoping that it's fascinating in service of student success.
So what can faculty do to help serve faculty who don't have the benefit of Minerva and your
Yep. Yep.
consultation to help serve students to meet these kinds of demands of the real world. Because whenever you talk about people being disillusioned, maybe with the way universities are working now, there are solutions and you have those solutions. And it's not just active learning. There are other things there that we can do as faculty to help our students thrive when they graduate.
Be an interested human. I think that academics are often rewarded for and pushed into narrow niches of expertise. It's kind of what the system wants us to do. We want to be experts. And I have to take a step back and be like, how many of my students are going to go be a neuroscientist? I still want to teach them about neuroscience. I want to get them passionate about the brain, about behavior, but I need to think about how that applies to the lives that students will lead and say, how do we take a step back and say, okay, well, an application of this is neurons connect with each other in this really fascinating way that creates this emergent property of consciousness. But there's lots of things in the world that have connections that create emergent properties. And how can I help them see that the thing they learned here will help them do something much more flexible outside? So I think when you open your mind a little bit about those core skills and how they could be useful outside of just your discipline, that serves students really well. I think the things you said about creating really engaging project-based assignments, the challenge there is that they're hard to grade, but they're so much more interesting. Everything is different. I'm not just giving people feedback on exactly the same stuff. I'm not just scantroning an exam. So thinking about how to create structures where students maybe are evaluating their own work, if that creates too much of a workload for you, that's a really important reflective exercise. So you can create cool assignments that then students are evaluating themselves as a mean for reflection, as a mean to reduce your grading load. So I think looking at what you've done and saying, hey, if I could start from a blank slate with this class and my goals were to help students see why what they're learning is relevant out in the real world and give them practice with the application of the knowledge, not just the retention of it, that's going to be transformative.
Application of durable skills for either future clients or employers. And this allows you to leverage your business background. What can students do in university to help them get that job? What is one core action that you would recommend they be doing before they graduate so that they can attract the best clients or the best employers?
Once you have your list of the skills that you're working on as a learner, one of the most powerful things you can do is keep track of where they showed up in your experience. And so if I'm taking your podcasting course, I know that I'm going to work on these skills. My work product was an example of my application of them. So then when I go to interview for a job, it might not have anything to do with podcasting. Maybe now I'm going to be creative director assistant. And I'm like, actually, I know these certain skills and I can tell you about a time I used them. And matching the core underlying kind of first principle things that you do to a variety of jobs is where students are going to be able to tell a story that's going to help them get a job, even if it's not directly related to the project where they use those skills. But if all we've done is say, hey, you made a podcast, and then I'm interviewing for something that's like laterally over here, I don't realize that there's a connection between them unless I'm either wildly flexible at thinking or I'm lucky. And so what I want students and faculty to do is to take luck a little bit out of the equation by being really explicit and intentional. Because then every project they do is a portfolio build for a potential interview question.
And I know that we sometimes have pushback against designing and creating for industry. And as someone who is
Yes.
always designing and creating for industry, because whatever communication industry you're interested in, it's always an industry. How do you meet that for students or faculty who are making the opposite argument?
So I certainly do not think that we should train little cogs in a machine to go be corporate shills. Like, I have a very large allergic reaction to that. I do think that we've taken that to an extreme and said we can just teach in our tiny little niche and students can get exposure to this thing that has nothing to do with the outside world and we can pretend that they're learning durable skills. And so it's sort of somewhere in between the pendulum is the right answer. And for me, the purpose of education is to teach people to thrive in the worlds that they will inherit and then shape. And so if you do that, they become good employees. Our job is to create good humans, and good humans are good employees. So there's this jump that people do almost as an allergic reaction to like training people for jobs. And one question I get a lot is, how do we even keep up with industry? The world's so quickly changing. I can't create a new program every time there's a new job like prompt engineering. Prompt engineering is clear, structured communication. Like, That's what you should have been teaching in the first place. And so you can't keep up with industry, but you can play a different game and you can focus on helping people be those agile thinkers who have those core skills. And that's what's going to help them be able to adapt to the world and have strong employment records. But if we're not teaching that to students explicitly and saying like, hey, these things are the things that are going to help you learn over time, then we're overly narrowing them the same way academics have been overly narrowed. And that doesn't seem very healthy either.
And I think this relates nicely to this idea of deep versus surface learning. And we have a big struggle a lot of times because people are busy. They have kids at home, they have work, they have all these other life stressors, and there's so much incentive to do surface learning. And as instructors, as faculty, as designers and curriculum designers, we're trying to do the opposite. Do you have any advice for faculty who are struggling with the same problem?
I think get out of your silo. This whole university gig economy, the academic freedom aspect of it actually makes teaching kind of lonely. And so if there are opportunities to team teach, if there are opportunities to say, hey, I'm teaching this course that comes after your course in a sequence, you can really kind of start to see the connections for yourself. Because one of the most transformative things you can do for faculty is have them see why this contributes to the overall curricular mission. A curriculum should be more than just like a series of classes that some student like randomly stumbled into. So I think really seeing that part in the system and what your contribution is requires understanding what the other pieces are. And that could be as simple as like taking somebody that you sort of know out to lunch, being like, hey, what's actually in your syllabus? And that can both get over the loneliness of some of this very siloed teaching, as well as then create ripple effects for students to see the connections between different aspects of their experience.
And you had a core advice for students. What about for faculty before we wrap up here? What's your core advice for faculty?
Backwards plan your course around more than just content. I think it's sort of redundant with all of the things you and I have been talking about, but you are in front of a classroom of people who have invested time and money, and there's an opportunity cost. And I think we take that seriously, but we want to do it in a way that's I'm here because I'm an expert, and you are, but your job is to not show your expertise. Your job is to help students acquire their own. So anything you can do in service of getting out of the way of the learning process is really important.
I think that is a great place to end our conversation because as faculty often don't realize we might be getting in the way of our students' progress and
Don't
learning.
mean to. Like, I think
Exactly.
we worry that all of this sounds I worry that our conversation makes it sound like faculty are intentionally trying to, like, harm students or not let them learn, and it's not. It's just we don't have enough training, enough conversations like this that are giving people actionable ideas to change what they're doing.
Well, I hope to get more actionable ideas in the future. Dr. Christine Lucer, could you tell us where to find you online?
LinkedIn, Steen E. Lucer. That is my only social media of choice. It kind of makes me a boomer, but I'm okay with it.
Dr. Christine E. Lucer, thank you for sharing your expertise. We appreciate your insights, your wisdom, and your time.
Ryan, this was so fun. Thanks for having a chat.